Okay,
Okay.
you ready?
Okay. Ready, yes.
Uh, if possible, is things, video, a chance to ask around or tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So it's a kind of one of Marx's technical expositions about capitalism. But the falling rate of profit argument is one piece of the jigsaw, and you can approach Marx through different pieces. So one big piece is notion of surplus value, which is linked also to a number of key words like exploitation, relative labour, and constant capital, and a whole range of terms which you'll be familiar with, the organic composition of capital. It's also linked to exploitation, historical materialism, dialectic. So when we discuss one aspect of Marx, like surplus value, we're also really discussing these much wider things as well. So let's bear that in mind. So in terms of surplus value, I'm not going to repeat the video or repeat what I said in the essay very much. Let's just remind ourselves that the theory of labour value, in other words, value derived from labouring, was not invented by Marx. In fact, his predecessors, the political economists Adam Smith, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and Malthus, all had theories of labour and had a view that in producing things and making things, value is created. But of course, they had no concept, no scientific concept of what's going on beneath all that. They had no concept of exploitation. They just had a market idea of exchange and buying and selling. So although Marx recognised their contribution in identifying labour as a source of profit, of course, he went far beyond them, which is where surplus value theory comes in and so on. Just a brief point about political economists, people like Smith and Ricardo. In true Marxist fashion, of course, they're part of a long line of economists. And I just draw your attention to what they replaced, really, which was a strange notion of economics called the just price, or the fair price, or the fair wage, or the just wage. In medieval Europe, so I'm speaking now about the European context, it would have been true elsewhere as well, of course. In the European context, in medieval Europe, there's a medieval concept of economics drawn from Aristotle, then Thomas Aquinas, from Roman law, and so on, which tried to understand how prices were generated in the marketplace. And they all linked prices and also, therefore, wages as a part of something called justice. A price and a wage had to be just. So this notion of justice is a very important part of wages and profits and prices. The medievalists, of course, played around with the subject. Different scholars different branches of Christianity and so on, all had a different account of just price and a just wage. But they recognise there's a justice dimension to both, which is something called a fair exchange. So this notion of a fair exchange predates Ricardo and Smith. And of course, Marx picks up on the notion of fair exchange to describe exploitation and the complete absence of fair exchange. So consider this continuity. So let's bear in mind that this notion that the price of something, its economic value, the wages paid by people to produce things, was of course discoursed in medieval Europe, but it's framed within a Christian methodology and a Greek Platonic methodology, and it was highly morally charged. So there's a notion of a just price and a just wage, and they had a notion of a false price. In particular, they talked about usury, and in Christian Europe, usury become a very taboo subject and was condemned by the church because it's linked to an unjust price and so on and so forth. So this notion of justice and prices and values and wages reverberates throughout Europe pre-capitalist times. It's picked up by Adam Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, but it took Marx to discover the true nature of justice in relation to prices and value. And so that's where he comes in. So I'll stop there, except to make the point, for Marx, exploitation, surplus value, it's not a moral issue as it was for the Christians. It's not a moral issue, it's a technical issue, it's a scientific issue. He tried to describe scientifically how exploitation emerges from a set of arrangements. And although he condemned exploitation and wanted to change it, his real point was, if it's not a kind of a moral, idealistic, utopian perspective, it was a scientific analysis of how exploitation emerges logically and unavoidably under capitalism. So the concept of surplus value, which the video describes very simply, seeks to show how exploitation arises from the selling of labour power and how capitalists use labour power to generate value. So I'll stop there because it's time's getting on, and let's open up the discussion. So you may have some questions emerging from the video or from my essay, so please ask questions and let's share.
Okay, let's have a discussion. You can ask questions.
I just wanted to start with a question, if nobody else minds. Could someone please really simply explain historical materialism to me? Because I've been trying to read up on it and I don't know, I don't get it.
You want an explanation on historical materialism?
Yeah, because I've seen it being repeated in last week's reading as well as this one, and I think it seems like an important concept.
I think we are discussing, we can have a separate discussion on that.
Okay, cool, thank you. But I had another question relevant to the essay regarding the utility theory of value. Can someone perhaps shed a light on why this utility theory of value is more widely favored over other value theories, for instance, in this week's session, the labor theory of value?
Yeah, so there are, Paul, how do you compare this with the modern theory of value, which he calls the utility theory of value? how do you compare it with the labor theory of value? So there are two theories of value, the modern labor theory of value and the classical labor theory of value. Why do you favor? Okay, Paul, you are mute. Paul, you are mute.
Unmute.
Yeah. Okay, now you are okay.
You must have muted me, yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, the two questions, one about historical materialism. It is a vast, complex subject, and it certainly merits its own separate session. But if I try to put it into a few words, we've discussed this in other contexts already. It's a historical materialism is a rejection by Marx of the dominant philosophy of the era in which he was living, which was German idealism. German idealism argued that the idea determined consciousness and determined how people behaved. What Marx did was to turn Hegel upside down and argue that consciousness and our ideas emerge from our actual lived realities. So for Marx, materialism refers to the fact that first and foremost, human beings have to eat, sleep, and reproduce. They have to survive, and they do so by actually working, by laboring, by producing things. So in other words, the essence of humankind lies in its material base of reproduction. And it is the way reproduction and production of necessities, later called commodities, it's the reproduction, production, and the manufacture of all the things we need to live. It's how that production is organized through social relations, determines current ideas, dominant philosophies, and so on and so forth. So for Marx, very simply, and it's a very crude simplification, historical materialism states that we analyze everything in humankind from our material living base. It's what we do to survive as a species. And everything else follows from that, including our ideas and our ideologies and our culture. And so this economic basis is our very essence as humankind. And of course, why is it called historical? Because this economic basis changes over time in history. It moves from one epoch to another epoch, from slavery to serfdom to capitalism, and one day socialism. So these are material phenomena about how we arrange our means of production. That's why it's called historical materialism. It is different to what's called idealism, which is about how ideas change the world. Marx inverted that kind of concept. It's not ideas don't change the world is changed from below in what's called the infrastructure, and that changes ideas and the evolution. So does that begin to make sense, Mel?
Yes.
Yes, very much so. Thank you so much.
Can we
I mean,
second question?
The second question is about comparing modern economic theory with marginal utility. It's just Tom's expertise, because he teaches this stuff every day.
Yeah.
The question actually is, why is utility theory of value favored over labor theory of value, rather than just a comparison between the two?
Yeah.
Well, there's one very simple answer to that, is that the marginal theory of value denies there's exploitation. Marx's great contribution to economics was to demonstrate, as of necessity, its exploitative basis. By definition, in history, through evidence, you can show that economic relations under capitalism, under previous modes as well, but especially under capitalism, involves the sheer exploitation of workers. In other words, workers are given less than they actually take. So there's a gap, which leads to inequality, poverty, and so on and so forth. Other theories, economic theories, which look at how you generate value and profit, because they look at the superficial arrangements, cannot see exploitation. And if there is exploitation, it is done by nasty people who behave excessively. Marx does not call capitalists nasty or evil, although they are that, of course. He does not call them evil. He simply says, by their very nature of the arrangements, they must exploit workers. So the major difference between Marx's theory of labour and other theories is that Marx demonstrates through the power of his argumentation and his evidence, demonstrates that exploitation takes place necessarily as a part of the arrangements. So exploitation is not a unhappy consequence. Sorry? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Let me find out where is the noise coming from. What's the disturbance?
So,
Paramjit.
so does that make sense?
Can I say something?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I think Marx does not deny the utilitarian value, because he talks about two values. He talks about use value and what determines the price. There are two different things. Use value is why you would buy something, or why you need it, and that's determined by the use value. So if there is no use for a particular commodity, nobody will buy it at any price. And I think the price is determined by what goes to manufacture it. So is by the labor power that's used in it, and the surplus value that it creates. So those are two different aspects of a commodity. There are two different properties of a commodity. One is, what is it worth in the marketplace, which is its price, which is determined by the labor necessary to produce it, or the socially necessary labor to produce it. And the other is, you can produce whatever you want and take a certain amount of labor to produce it. It would not find a market because there would be no use value for it. So the utilitarian value is actually how useful is the particular product or particular commodity, and the price is what is determined by the labor necessary to produce it.
Yeah, so Marx actually refers to, he talks about the use value of a product and its exchange value.
Yeah.
So they're two different things. So there's use value and exchange value. So to have a use value, someone needs to use it. But to have an exchange value, someone has to buy it. So use and exchange aren't quite synonymous. You may need something, but you can't afford to buy it. So Marx makes a very important distinction between use value and exchange value, as Naeem has explained. So it's a key difference in Marx's theory. Use value and exchange value are two different things residing in the same commodity. So this is one of Marx's famous contradictions, is that use and exchange aren't synonymous. They are in tension, and the only way a capitalist makes a profit is to exchange a commodity, not to use it. So capitalists do not produce commodities for use, although they have a use value. they produce commodities to exchange them for a profit. So this is what's called, in Marx's terms, the fetishization of commodities. In a socialist world, we would be producing things of use to be sold for use and to be used by people for good reasons. Capitalists produce products not to be used, but to be exchanged for a profit. And that's a big distinction, which other theories of economics do not recognize. So we need to hang on to this distinction. It's a very important part of Marx's whole premises, use value and exchange value. And this distinction also appears when you look at wages. The worker sells his or her labor. In other words, it's a commodity and it's exchanged. So a worker's labor power has exchange value, which is discussed in the things I sent around, exchange value. So the capitalist buys the laborer's power, which is which is mental and physical, for a price, for a wage. And that wage is, generally speaking, just enough so that worker can reproduce him or herself so that they can eat, take shelter, clothe themselves, and come back next day to do the same day's work. So the labourer's exchange power, the labourer's power, which is exchanged with the capitalist, is set at the basic minimum to reproduce oneself as a worker. That does get changed because of powers of workers, but it's another story. Then the worker has a use value. The capitalist has brought a use value, which is the worker who labours all day. So there we have the labourer as a use value. They are of use to the capitalist. The labourer has exchanged that power by selling his labour to the capitalist, who then uses the worker as a commodity. So you can see the connection between the use value and exchange value. The point being that the exchange value given to the worker for their labour is far less than the use value extracted from the labourer by the capitalist. So here we have another contradiction between use value and exchange value. So it's a very important part of Marx's economics, use and exchange. It explains how surplus value is generated, which in turn is translated into profit on the market. Does that make sense to who raised that question? Was it Mel, was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Naeem, from your point of view? Naeem, does that square with your understanding?
More or less, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just ask what the utility theory of value is? I'm not really up to date on economics.
Tom, this is you teach this stuff.
Yeah, I thought the one difference between the labor theory of value and the marginal utility theory of value is looking at from supply side and the demand side. So the demand side is the utility theory of value, and the supply side would be the labor theory of value. So I think Paul did not explain the socially necessary labor time. That will decide. Okay, now to answer that question about what is the utility theory. So there was a philosophy, they start from the philosophy of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. So that philosophy says that the purpose of our life is to maximize our utility. Okay, so they have taken that idea of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism to economics. So you can apply this at a particular this idea to a particular good. When you buy a good, you buy it to in order to achieve some satisfaction or some utility. So, so by the end of the 19th century, some economics took this idea and expanded it. I mean, applied it and put a number on any good that you consume. They're called the utility, and then total utility, marginal utility. So this way, a person will buy a good. I have not organized my thought. How many goods a person will buy? So the ideology, the idea here is that a person will buy a good. Let us take a good of, let us say we are buying. This can be applied to a simple good that you buy more units, more and more units, number of units. Let us say one apple. If you buy one apple,
Mars bar. Mars bar.
Mars bar.
A Mars bar.
Yeah, okay. Or let us say that when you are very hungry, one apple or one Mars bar it has got huge utility. And the second one will have less utility. The third one will have still less utility. They call this diminishing marginal utility. The additional utility goes on declining. That makes sense, isn't it? If you can say that satisfaction is called utility, this idea is called utilitarianism. And then you compare this with the price. The price is the cost. That is the price. Again, in my opinion, labor theory of value is underlined in that actually. We can say like this. The pleasure comes from consuming a thing. The price you pay comes from is the pain, because that money has come because you have spent some labor to get that money. So money is equal to pain. That is a cost for you. The utility is the benefit for you, the pleasure for you. So you compare pain and benefit. So you will buy the number of units of apples or Mars bars you will buy depend on comparing the price and the utility. Based on this, you construct the law of the market, and this idea is called utilitarianism.
How does that differ from Marxist value of use? Marx also talks about use value.
Yes.
As something that is, how useful a particular product is,
yes,
or something is to anybody.
Yes.
Then only they will buy it.
Correct. Yeah, that Marx also agrees to that. But he
So
also has, in my opinion, he also has got a demand side. In fact, in my opinion, Samuelson said
the price is determined by demand.
Yeah. In fact, if I read correctly, there was an economist called Samuelson, Paul Samuelson. He got the first Nobel Prize in 1969. He died a few years ago, some 10 or 15 years ago. He said that Marx also believes in the utilitarian theory, and therefore we should discount this Marxian labor theory of value, because the idea behind it was that how will you
that's where the mistake is, isn't it? That's where the mistake is.
Yeah,
that's a falsehood. It's a straightforward falsehood.
Because this argument was
a falsehood.
Yeah,
it's false very simply because the marginal utility theory of economics is purely based upon subjective needs and wants. It's at the superficial individual level.
Correct.
And all that particular economics does is look at behaviors of individuals. Marx was not concerned about individual behaviors and psychological wants and needs. He's concerned about structures. And of course, Marx had a view about supply and demand. He inherited that from Adam Smith. So supply and demand is a part of the marketplace. And as we discussed last week, with supply and demand in the marketplace, you either get overproduction of commodities leading to a crisis, or underconsumption because people can't afford to buy commodities. So supply and demand is built into Marx's notion of crisis. But supply and demand is a symptom, not the cause of anything. Supply and demand does not cause the market to operate. Supply and demand is simply the appearance of the market operating. Underneath the appearance of the market, there's Marx's notion of something much deeper called mode of production, social relations, and exploitation. Of course, so with the marginal theory of utility, the classic case of the Mars bar, a Mars bar sets the price of a Mars bar, at the point at which I no longer wish to pay for it. So I might pay £5 for a Mars bar because I'm desperately hungry. I might pay a £1 for my 4th Mars bar because I'm greedy. For my 10th Mars bar, I don't want to buy because I'm saturated. So I got to sell the price for Mars bar, just 1 Mars bar less than 10 to generate and maintain consumption of Mars bars. So marginal theory is a way of setting a price before people become saturated. And that's how it works. But Marx is not concerned about that kind of petty detail, that microeconomics. He's on about macroeconomics. He's on about deep underlying structures, not about individual wants and needs. Yeah,
it's called microeconomics.
I think Surinder wants to raise the question. Yeah.
No, I think Marx didn't say Marx use value as an objective measure. Because food is useful and that's why people buy it. But how useful food is does not necessarily determine its price. Its price is determined by what it takes to make that food, right? And what is the supply and demand relationship at a particular time. So the average price for that food will be determined by the labor necessary to produce it.
Yeah, correct.
But at any one time, it will fluctuate around the laws of supply and demand. So I think the supply and demand does not, use value has no impact on the supply and demand as such, except for the fact that it determines whether something will be sold or not. If it's no use value, nobody will buy it. Okay, but if it has got a use value and it's very, very useful, then it's most people will buy it. But because of the law of supply and demand, they will buy it around the cost of producing it.
Yeah,
so
that
would be
that would be the natural price. That will be a fair price according to the medieval economic theory.
I really don't know anything about the medieval or whatever, but what I'm saying is prices, even in the medieval times, when people produce things, there will be those laws would still apply. All right, the relationship of production would be different. The exploitation and the surplus value, how that is shared out, would be different. But the fact that a farmer has to spend so many hours to produce it would be what will determine the price in his case. And he has to then pay for the labor power that is necessary to produce it, which will be what it costs to keep himself going.
Yeah, I think
Surinder had a hand up. Yeah, Surinder was asking a question, Tom.
Yeah. Surinder.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I've got a question about what effect class struggle and the professionalization of certain types of occupations have in determining the price of labor. So, you've got trade unions on the one hand trying to defend or set a price for labor. You've also got professions that, argue that we need education and all that sort of stuff to, I don't know, is that the sort of increasing the socially necessary labor that, or the price of that in that? So what sort of impact does that have on setting the price?
It has a very powerful impact. Setting wages or prices. Setting wages or prices.
Yeah, wages as the price of labor, yeah.
So, Marx is always talking at a very abstract level. So and what he tends to do is talk about an average situation. So he often talks about what an average person needs to averagely reproduce themselves. So there's this notion, an abstract notion. He recognizes that in history, there are lots of examples which deviate from the average. So, and of course, this is where class warfare comes into it. A capitalist logically wants to pay as little money as possible to the worker to maximize exploitation. The worker wants to get as much pay as possible to be less exploited and have a better income. So underlying all this economic structure, there is class warfare. This warfare is played out in the workplace through the capitalists trying to increase the working day, the workers trying to reduce the working day, capitalists trying to decrease wages, and workers trying to increase wages, and it's a tussle. When trade unions get organised, and when other factors come into play, workers can raise their wages. So sometimes wages rise, which go beyond the basic staples of life. And this has been especially true in the old capitalist heartlands of Western Europe and America, that over a century of fighting, trade unions in particular have managed to retain more of which has been taken away from them. So they reduce the profit margins for capitalists by increasing their wages. And Marx made a very important observation, which also reflects his own 19th century racialized mindset. He talked about wages are set as a minimum in accordance with how advanced the country is. So he talked about more advanced civilizations, more civilized countries, meaning Britain and Western Europe, where workers expect more for their labor. And as a consequence, they raise their wages because of this kind of cultural expectation. Whereas in other countries, and here referring, of course, to what used to be called the Third World or the Global South, people's expectations about wages are so much lower, they can get away with paying much lower wages. So he has this notion of civilized countries where the workers get paid better because that's how things have evolved. So although the socially necessary element of labour is what a worker needs to reproduce themselves, the basics of food, shelter, clothing, those kind of things, through a period of struggle, then the worker can get a bit more than that, get a bit of cash in their pockets, which of course is needed to buy all those consumable things being produced by capitalists. But of course, wages go down as well. So if you look historically at wages, although individual workers and individual firms and individual sectors and different unions manage to get better wages for their workers, it's at the expense of other workers. Surplus value is finite in terms of an economy. So if some is given to some set of workers, then it will be likely the case that some will be taken away from other sectors. That's how capitalists work. So there's always a difference in wages. And some groups of workers have become very unionized and very professionalized, who control access to the profession, like doctors and teachers, for example, because access to their professions is controlled, so there's barriers to entry. They can, of course, make more demands to get better wages. Whereas if you're not unionized and you're in low-skilled jobs, when there are many people can do those jobs, then wages tend to go down. So there's a link between skills and scarce capabilities and knowledge versus low-skilled labour. Low-skilled labour naturally is paid at a low rate because there's so many people able to do it, whereas high-skilled jobs, especially technical jobs, and in managerial jobs which help run the system, they can demand better wages because of supply and demand. So
how would they explain hyperinflation of wages, say with footballers and bankers and the hyperinflation? How does Marxism explain that?
But this refers to about less than 0.5% of the population. It's marginal to his general argument. That is
Well, it's
simply
still there,
supply and
isn't it?
demand.
It's quite, well, in terms of society, it's quite an important factor, isn't it?
Yeah,
And it's particularly in terms of the division of wealth and stuff, it's quite a major
yeah,
factor.
absolutely. Yeah. There's probably in Britain about 1,000 footballers who earn fabulous wages. The average footballer wage is about £25,000 a year. People just talk about the millions for top stars.
So how does Marxism explain that trend then in the last 20, 30 years?
Well, that's it. Well, because the reasons why top footballers get paid, I think the highest pay is £650,000 a week. So some of the top players like Messi and other people, and Ronaldo, are paid over £500,000 a week. Now, that's because football's become a business. You can be rest assured that if a business is giving someone £500,000 a week wages, they're getting far more back than that themselves as profits.
Yeah.
So if you look at TV fees for football, TV fees, it runs into billions of pounds a year. But people want to see good top players on TV.
I was thinking about in terms of socially necessary labour, you know, how does that, I can't see how that squares.
No, football is not, sorry, football, get this clear, football is not about social necessary labour. Football does not generate any value whatsoever in Marxist terms. It is entertainment. It doesn't, nothing's made.
Okay, Naim has an answer.
Yeah, I think let's return back to Marxist understanding of things. Yeah. There are a couple of things that determine the price of anything. First of all, it is a price around the socially necessary labor to create that object is the price. Okay.
Yeah,
then
wages,
there is a law of supply and demand that actually determines the final price for it. So when we are talking about very few footballers who are in, I can't name footballers because I don't take much interest in it, but the very few footballers who are earning millions of pounds are very, very scarce. So what they are getting is not what is the socially necessary labor or necessary to create a footballer. What they are getting is the scarcity value. So there is very, very, very few footballers who can play at that level. Yes. And therefore they get a very, very high price for it. Yeah. They are way above the socially necessary labor required to produce them. Because a lot of the footballers who are playing for, ordinary teams are not earning that much money. Yes. And that same applies to everybody else. So I think that's one aspect of it. And as Paul is right, there are very few footballers in that range. And there are very, very few people. So, it doesn't work. Now, the other thing is about how the socially necessary labor to reproduce labor is worked out. And I think Marx talked about it, that it is a historical thing. So what was historically necessary to produce a doctor 200 years ago now is a lot more, okay? Because of two reasons. First off, because of technology, but also because of the class struggle, all right? And I'm not talking necessarily about doctors. We have now said that everybody must have education, okay? Whereas, in the 18th and the 19th century, children were sent into the mines without any education. So we have determined now that the socially necessary labor required to create a worker requires 16 years of education. All right. Now that is achieved through class struggle. We've also said that any worker must be provided with basic national health services. All right. Now that has become also a historically socially necessary labor to reproduce ourselves. Right. So that's how we determine it. But I think capitalism still works, and that's why they go to the third world countries to colonization and to actually, manufacturing in conditions that where the socially necessary labor to reproduce labor is much, much lower. All right. So all that remains here is something that requires very high education. And that's why what you see, the development of, you know, the forgotten working class that you know has not benefited from the neoliberal capitalism in the West.
Yes, I wanted to add one thing about this and also say one joke. Have a break. This, what Naim is saying is that in the case of labor, in the case of the footballers, labor theory of value is not applicable. So labor theory of value is not a good thing. We have to consider the demand.
No. It's a misunderstanding, Thomas, what you're saying.
That means you are going to the neoclassical economics. So
no. I think you misunderstood me. I never said that. I said even in the case of a footballer, Marx talks about two things that determine price.
Yes.
One is supply and demand.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You cannot have prices without supply and demand. Marx says that.
Yes.
Right. And then there is the amount of labor required to produce a commodity.
Yes.
Okay. So the scarcity of a commodity may drive the price very, very high, which is what's happening with the footballer.
Correct.
Okay. Now the law, the Marxist value, Marxism still applies in the case of that. But the only thing is, because the supply is so low, the prices are very high.
Correct.
Which is what Marx talks about as well.
Correct.
What I'm just trying to say is that
the supply could be higher in terms
at a much higher rate, price than what is required to produce it. That's why they make huge amount of profits. Okay, so
there is a shortage of the supply of that special type of footballer.
But I think, say, footballers, there could be a much greater supply.
Yes.
You know, the world is full of brilliant footballers who could be.
Correct.
Could be them. You know, they just haven't been discovered or they've been put down somewhere.
But that happens, isn't it? That's why they try and open the market to bring footballers from everywhere. Cricketers come from everywhere.
Yeah.
So,
you know, most of the English cricketers were
Coppola wants to say something.
So sorry, an important technical point because we keep track of the discussion.
Yeah. Is that say something?
That apart from supply and demand and the social necessary cost of replacing the workers, reproducing the worker. For Marx, a part of the price includes what he calls constant capital, or what's called dead labour. So when the capitalist works out the price on the market, it contains not just the actual prices of the cost of production includes the labour wages and also the replacement cost of machines which produce the commodity. And as we discussed last week about declining rates of profit, as you increase machinery and technology, that cost goes up and the price of labour goes down, leading to a declining rate of profit. Now, with a footballer, there's no machine to replace a footballer. All footballing activity is labour. There's no machine producing a part of a product called a footballer. So that's why all the money goes into a footballer, not into machinery. You can't automate a footballer. You know, there's no robot playing football. So there's a very important distinction where workers have a monopoly on labour, on production, then they command very high wages because there's no machine to bring down the cost of production. So when you're looking at productivity, when you're looking at wages, it applies to teachers. It's gradually changing, but until recent times, there's no machinery to replace teachers or to do a teacher's job. Teachers were teachers, and all the effort, all the productivity went through the person called a teacher. If you can produce online work and if you can produce machines and transcripts, and if you can automate teaching, And what will happen is, in the long run, a teacher's salary will go down. They're replaced by machines, and a teacher will have less use value because there's a machine doing it better. So an issue around wages and prices is, where does machinery come into the process? Because machines are expensive and they have running costs and they wear out and need to be replaced. So that's called, in Marx's term, constant capital, which is built into the price for a product alongside the labour costs. So when we have these discussions about wages, bear in mind the automation process.
Yeah, correct.
And
Yeah.
Can I just ask a bit about that? I found, Paul, thank you for the article. I found this week's a bit more difficult to understand compared to last week's article, though. But if you think of this production and labor value, etc., as a small closed unit, which is how it's talking about average and all that, I can understand it. But considering we are a linked and a global economy, so we keep talking about cost to produce a labor here is different to a third world country, but that's constantly changing. So does that not have an impact? The fact that in the 19th century, people capital got exported to colonies or whatever, different ways of exploitation of the colonies under imperialism, different. Does that not have an impact? Does the cost to produce a worker in this country, has that gone down because of globalization? You see what I mean? Yeah. So does that in turn, does that have an impact on the surplus value that's being created here?
Well, the point is, in terms of your line of argument, surplus value is not being produced here. It's being produced in China or in India, or in Malaysia or Hong Kong. Exactly. And what happens is, so the capitalist is always searching for a cheaper source of labour. So we now have a strange phenomena that some production is being moved from China to Mexico, because Mexico is cheaper than China. Yeah. As China becomes wealthier and workers become more organised and more educated, their wages rise. So that means that factory in China has been sent to Mexico, where wages are still very low. So there's always a pursuit of a cheapest source of labour by capitalists. And they haven't run out yet. There's the whole of South America, the whole of Central America, and many other places. What happens is, of course, as capital transfers to other continents, and as does production, it means that in the old heartlands of capitalism, Britain in particular, the working class have been, as they say, left behind. They've been abandoned. They become unemployed. Because business is transferred elsewhere, so they lose their jobs. They have no jobs to go to. There's a massive army of unemployed. Where you have unemployed army of ex-workers, where there are jobs to go to, their wages are very low because there's so many people chasing the one job. So Britain's become split into two. It's a high-tech finance capitalist society, with finance capitalist monopoly and city of London, but for large swathes of Britain, there's lots of impoverished working class people who have no jobs to go to, and their standards of living are declining. So one of the consequences of surplus value, a chase for surplus value, it leaves behind casualties. There's the so-called great Trump appealed to what are called the Rust Belts of America, where the same thing happened. Millions of white working class labourers saw their jobs sent abroad. they lost their jobs. It's called a rust belt because of rusting old factories. And of course, in Britain, we have the old red heartlands of the northeast and northwest, which have been were abandoned by Blair's Labour. They were left to slowly die a slow death. The coal mines were closed. And they had no real jobs to go back to. So one of the impact is that there are casualties all over the place. That's a feature of exploitation. They're not being exploited directly. They've been exploited because they don't have any jobs to go to, because jobs have gone elsewhere. So the whole thing is connected on a global scale now, on a global scale. Don't forget that historically, in the heyday of the British Empire, the British working class benefited from cheap imports. One way to maintain workers' wages in Britain during the British Empire and after the war for about 20 years, while they're still colonies, is that workers' wages were subsidised by the exploitation of the global south. In other words, the poverty of the global south was a condition of the relative affluence of the working class in Britain.
Yeah.
And that was the heydays of the 70s, when, to quote Macmillan, you never had it so good.
Mm.
People could buy cars and fridges and go on holidays. They could go to Spain and Portugal and all those kind of things. Suddenly, the white working class had spare cash in their pockets because capitalism could exploit the global south and give a bit more to the workers back home. But that stopped in the 70s. Thatcher stopped all that. So there are connections. So this exploitation linked to surplus value permeates the whole world. It changes over time.
Yes. So I wanted to make one intervention. I was reminded of the Corn Laws. Paul, you may know about the Corn Laws. There was a controversy.
Yeah, what about?
Yeah, this is what same thing that you are saying. There was a controversy about passing Corn Laws, about the imports of corns to Britain from Europe, I think other countries. The capitalist class were, the British agriculture farmers were saying it should not be imported, then the prices will go down, they will lose. But if it is imported, the corn price, the food price will become less. So it will, and the socially necessary, what is that? The minimum wage, socially necessary, the amount of wages can be kept low.
Less wages.
Yeah, less wages can be kept low. It will benefit the industrialist class. Finally, they passed the. This is saying subsidizing, making by the importing goods.
So the Corn Laws were a big fight between agriculture vested interests, the old aristocracy, versus the new manufacturing elites of Manchester and so on and so forth, who voted Liberal. So the manufacturing classes were determined to abolish. If people don't know, the Corn Laws are very simple. The import of corn, or wheat, as it's called in this country, the import of wheat or grain was highly taxed to protect homegrown wheat, to protect rich farmers. Only when the price of corn or wheat got too high, then imports were allowed. So it's a kind of ratchet system. It's like the common market in the EU. It's designed to protect rich farmers for tariffs. The abolition of the Corn Laws, which eventually won through on the principles of so-called free trade, enabled cheaper imports of corn, which enabled the manufacturing class of Manchester to pay their workers less money because living was cheaper. So this is another example, as Tom says, of where cheapening the cost of living by whatever means and enables capitalists to reduce wages accordingly. It's a beautiful example. Described as a free trade war.
Surinder?
I think Surinder wants to say something.
Could I ask about the role of women and also of labour-saving devices? So socially necessary labour, particularly for men, was reduced, the cost of that was reduced by women's unpaid labour. then also, you know, later on we've got the labour saving devices, which presumably reduce again the cost of socially necessary labour, but on the other hand, they could make it more expensive. What sort of, I don't know what sort of political economy has been, you know, analysed about that. How does what's the impact of women's labour on socially necessary labour time, generally of men, and then what's the impact of labour saving devices on that?
Well, that's a beautiful example, isn't it, of a divided working class, in this case along gender lines. So because of historically oppressive attitude towards women, which predated capitalism, it was deemed acceptable to pay women less money for the same job. So women were forced into a workplace under capitalism to supplement the household income. But of course, women could be paid at a lower rate for the same work for historical reasons, therefore increasing the surplus value of capitalists. In other words, they paid less for the same work as men did. So that's why women were often increasingly employed in the workplace in lots of factories. If you read Engels' account of Manchester, he's describing factories of women working at machines all day long, being supervised by men, you know, supervisors in the main, but women are doing the work, all the sewing and that sort of thing, because they were cheaper to employ. So for sexist reasons, for gender biased reasons, which are built into the fabric of society. And of course, better still, if you could employ children, then you could pay even less. So you had a kind of hierarchy of wages: children, women, and men. And of course, social reformers gradually prohibited child labour. They gradually restricted the exploitation of women. So, for example, women were banned from coal mining at some point, as were children. But of course, as it's a gender fight also, within the working class men fought to maintain the differentials. So this is an example of a fractionalized working class under capitalist conditions. And the same thing applies to race. So for racialized reasons, it is deemed acceptable to pay black people less money for the same job. So and that differential is maintained by the white working classes. A racialized division within the working class built around wages.
The industrial reserve army of labour, isn't it? That for migrants anyway, their cost of reproduction has been borne by their country of origin. So
yeah, absolutely. But also, of course, they're deemed to be less civilized, as Marx would say. If you read Engels' critique of Irish people, it's awful. Yeah. He calls them apes, half humans, who live in bestial conditions. He said they live like pigs. Deeply racist concepts in Engels and Marx, standard for the day. But the point is that it is deemed to be entirely appropriate to pay Irish labourers far less than English labour because they are less civilised. Their actual living needs were much lower down. They can live like a pig. You pay them as a pig. That's the mentality. So even within the working class, this notion of surplus value and socially necessary labour is being played out as a kind of internecine warfare within the working class itself. So it's a very important point. Now we have to recognise that fact, you know, and of course paying workers in the global south and white workers benefiting is also part of the racialized feature of capitalism. It's racialized because under the capitalist mindset, black people, brown people, or non-white people are deemed to be somehow less human, who require less needs, so they can be exploited better.
So does the labour saving devices reduce the cost of labour, or do they increase it?
Well, yes, you're hitting a very important point in economics, because this is about the overproduction and underconsumption and economic growth argument. If a factory is producing, I remember my mother getting her first washing machine. So every Monday, my mother would wash all her clothes in a big tub of boiling water. Then she'd have a mangle, and I would help her mangle, you know, every Monday. And one day, on hire purchase, and note this, on hire purchase, a washing machine turned up in her house, and for the first time in her life, she could put all her clothes into the washing machine, press a button, and go and do something else. And that was brought on hire purchase. So that's, and eventually a washing machine, like a TV and a fridge, become an expected part of basic living standards of living, including a washing machine, a TV, even a telephone, paid for, of course, on credit, but through credit finance, but also because of the rising wages of workers in Britain, at the expense, of course, of washerwomen in India. You know, so there's a connection, and these connections get played out in all sorts of ways. As Mark says, you have to examine each location with its particular circumstances to understand what's going on. Marx was talking about a general kind of trend at a very abstract level, recognizing that any particular situation, there would be deviations from the trend. Just like prices deviate from a natural price, but in the end, they end up being the same, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Ryan wants to say something, I think.
Yeah.
And I think to answer Surinder's question, you really need to look at, you know, if we look, for example, in Britain, we have determined that the socially necessary labor required to keep the worker going is based on many things. A lot of them is being derived from the class struggle in terms of the health service, education, and everything else. So those things have actually added to the price of labor, the socially necessary amount of money required to keep the labor going, right? That also means that we have said that we need to have a certain amount of leisure hours. We need to have so many holidays and everything else. That is now socially determined cost of reproducing ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Now, what the capitalists would do is look at that and say, well, okay, I've got £1,000 to invest. I've got a choice. I can invest that in Britain, where the socially necessary labor to reproduce labor itself is much, much higher, all right? And also, I have to put a lot more constant capital into it, which will not bring me anything, okay? So where would I put this £1,000? In a cheap factory in Bangladesh, where, you know, all I have to do is to buy a machine that costs £200, all right? Instead of a machine that costs £100,000. And I pay the laborer who will work 18 hours instead of 8 hours she will work, and 16 hours for herself. So what will be cheaper? It will be going to Bangladesh, and that's what he does. Right?
Absolutely,
that's why all the cotton factories have closed down here, and they've all opened up in Bangladesh. Now, you know, that is the reason why there's a diminishing return as well, because the capital, both constant and variable capital, is quite high. You know, labor power is much lower in Britain when it's employed. Right. So I think that those are the things that determine the prices or the wages for us. But ultimately, we live in one global system, all right? And therefore, it does not. It may have benefited the working class in this country for decades, or few decades, or even half a century, to profit from they were deriving from the colonies. But at the end of the day, you know, if everything starts moving back to the south, all right, then here it also suffers, which is what we're seeing.
Absolutely. A good example of this, of course, is actually down the road at Cadbury's. The Cadbury's factory in Bourneville is that about 10 years ago, Cadbury's, a long-established British firm, a famous Quaker firm, was brought up by an American firm called Kraft. And as soon as they brought it up, they started producing a lot of Cadbury stuff in Poland. They opened up a factory in Poland and produced certain Cadbury products in Poland because it's cheap labour. But interesting enough, so the productivity of Cadbury's in Bourneville went down. It employed less workers, and workers took voluntary retirement. Upwards, reduced the workforce. Ironically, now that Poland is a booming economy and is growing economically, they're moving that factory back to Bourneville because it's cheaper in Bourneville to employ people than it is in Poland. Would you believe it? That is the nature of
Polish
capitalism.
workers, probably.
That's what Thatcher wanted.
It chases the cheapest source of labour, and it's quite ruthless. It would go wherever. It will go back and forwards wherever it suits them. That's the only criteria. So how do I reduce my operating costs to maximise my profit? That's the only criteria. It's not being evil. It is that. It's not being immoral. It is that. It's not being unjust. It is that. It's the sheer logic of capitalism. It can't operate any other way. It must behave like that, otherwise it goes out of business. And this is Marx's great contribution, the scientific nature of capitalism and its contradictions. And that's why he called himself a scientific socialist, not a utopian socialist, not a romantic socialist. His was a hard-nosed analysis of capitalism and its contradictions and what it's compelled to do. Chase the cheapest labour to make the biggest profit. And that's what it's been doing since Marx's time, and it's still doing 150 years later, very, very successly.
Okay.
Right, can I make a quick point? I've been trying to for quite a long time.
Yeah,
I'll be very brief. I think we're going definitely going off track, talking about going back to previous part of the discussion, talking about footballers and doctors. Footballers and doctors don't produce commodities. There are very they're specific people who produce commodities, workers, and those people, those workers who produce commodities produce surplus value. And with them, we look at the concept of the socially necessary labour time, the cost of reproduction of labour, and in order to work out what the surplus value they produce is. Doctors and lawyers and footballers and people who work in pubs and this sort of thing, they are not producing commodities, they are not producing surplus value. And what they are parasites, effectively, being paid out of the surplus value, which is produced by workers, and principally, as everybody's correctly been saying in the last few contributions, principally from the surplus value produced in the global south, in the poorer countries which are being exploited by imperialism.
I think you are very, very harsh.
Just want to make the point sharply.
we can take away the
How about
sharpness. It's a simple thing. First of all, let's get this clear because this is a myth. First of all, Marx did not deny that a service could be a profit-generating surplus value.
Right, yeah.
It gives a beautiful example. I can't recall where it comes from offhand. If you're interested, I can post it to you. He says, I'm paraphrasing, he says, I don't care if it's a sausage factory or a private school. He said, if a teacher is being paid to deliver a service paid for by a parent, and that school pays that teacher less than what the parents pay, in other words, I make a surplus, I make a profit, surplus value, but that's also exploitation. It's not quite so. You can exploit teachers in the private sector because a service is a commodity It is quite true, we said this last week, it is quite true that Marx hardly developed the idea of a commodity being a service, but he had that in mind, as that example generates. He gave another example of a clown. He said, you can be a clown who goes around and entertains children at children's parties. That's your work. That's how you reproduce yourself. That's how you earn a wage to live next day, how to clothe and eat and care for your family. So that is straightforward. That's simply what's called simple exchange. I exchanged my clowning time for a payment.
Yep.
He said, if that clown belonged to a company of clowns employed by a clown employer, who is sent out for a wage, and that employer generates a profit from them going out because he charges more for their appearance than he pays the clown, that is a form of exploitation. It's not as sharp as commodities, but it's making the same point. It's not so clear cut. With regard to people like doctors and teachers, it is quite true, they do not generate any surplus value. They're actually a charge against the capitalist as a part of the arrangements. In other words, the salaries of doctors and teachers, we're not here talking about the private sector, by the way, we're talking about state teachers and state doctors, people who provide a public service through the state, are paid for from taxes collected from workers and capitalists. So in other words, there's a social wage, which includes also benefits, income support, and that sort of thing, disability benefits, housing benefits. There's a social wage extracted from capitalist profits as best as we are able to pay for these necessary auxiliary jobs. So capitalism requires teachers, capitalism requires doctors to care for the population, at least in this kind of country, and therefore their wages, they do not produce anything of value in terms of capitalism, but they provide the service needed to keep capitalism going, which is slightly different. So they're a charge upon profits out of surplus value, which includes taxes on workers' wages and taxes on corporations. I mean, no story about taxing corporations. I don't think it's true to say, although it's nicely polemical, it's not true to say that doctors are parasites. They provide kind of what's called a functional service, or what's called a subaltern service, to keep the system going.
I think Marx went as far as to define labor itself, labor power as a commodity.
Yeah.
Okay, and that is human beings basically. And we talk about labor power as a socially necessary labor. Its price is determined by the socially necessary labor required to create it. Now, if we look at the labor power today in Britain, it's made up by the fact that it has got to be educated for 16 years by a teacher. So what is that teacher doing if it's not creating a commodity, all right, which is labor? Okay. Similarly with the doctor, right? He is keeping the labor alive. He's creating, he is, taking part in the process of actually bringing to life that labor itself. Okay. So all the value that's enshrined in that person who then goes on after 16 years or 18 years or whatever many years to become labor, a commodity, is actually, is being produced by those doctors, those teachers, and those people in the welfare state. Without it, that socially necessary labor power would not exist. So I think, it is a very difficult concept to think in terms of that only commodities are things that are physical. They're not. They're human beings as well, and in Marxist terms, they are human beings because Marx talked about labor power itself as a commodity.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay,
Well, it's sold by labor. Yeah.
Shall we wind up? So let us wind up.